Okay, so we're working on our character controllers and our character controller script still, refining it. I sat into or sort of listened into the major class today, and it seems like most of you are still sorting out your cameras and just controller behavior and things like that. So that's understandable. You still have some time. It's not a major train smash, and also it's an ongoing process. You're always going to be refining and making things better and making sure that they're bug free, and you're going to pick up strange behavior in places when you test it and use it more often. So that's all fine. Like I said last week, um, it's not, if there's mistakes, it's not a problem. If bugs creep in, it's not a problem. It's when there's only bugs to work with, or where there's nothing really tangible other than things freaking out, then it's problematic. So just make sure that you've got the basics right, and if the odd thing does go funny, it's not the end of the world. Okay, so don't get too fixated on it. The idea is also to make progress and not um, just have one mechanic working or something like that. I know, like sometimes it's like there's a moving platform. My character doesn't get stuck on the platform, and I can't. It doesn't want to move, or it keeps on slipping off. So now I have to rebuild my entire character controller because you can't stick to platforms. Um, that's certainly not the way to go. There's always a workaround or some sort of a patch that you could figure out to keep your things intact, or forego the moving platform for now. All right. So one of the other things that we also need to discuss, or maybe you can just start getting your head around this. Okay, so it's ragdoll physics that we're going to look at. Ragdoll physics they're fun. They're sort of the typical gang beasts um, controllers, but we often see them when I think gang beasts is a particular um, subcomponent or application of ragdoll physics that we didn't really see or wasn't really as mainstream as it is now. We find more controllers acting as ragdolls, and we can do that as well. We could have controllers that are sort of driven primarily through ragdoll physics, and then what happens is that you sort of target. So you have an animator, and then you have a ragdoll rig that sort of targets or tries to stick to the ragdoll or to the animator rather. So you kind of have two rigs simultaneously. Um, that's a very specific type of controller. So we didn't really cover that. I'm going to show you what the ragdoll does, and then you can decide on whether you want to, go that route and completely build another ragdoll rig on top of the one that you have to drive it and see what that does in physics. Or perhaps it's just something that you want your enemies to have, like when you shoot them, or maybe when you fall off a certain height, then you turn ragdoll. It's just there's no sort of seamless transition between or back and forth from ragdoll um, to non-ragdoll um, unless you spend a great deal of time building that into the controller. So it's sort of a gimmick. And then the other thing that we're looking at is um, animator overrides. Okay, so that's also something that you could do without. It's for like additional enemies and stuff, and we'll look at the base sort of case applications as well. Then I listed one or two more resources, and the thing that I want you to start thinking about is this simple yet suitable mechanics that you can introduce into your white box world that would complement your controller and the interaction of it. So if we're doing like, let's say you have an example of a character that slides. Right now there's no reason for the character to slide if the entire world that it interfaces with is just a flat plane. um, you need to have like bars or certain blocks or colliders or things in place for the character to slide underneath. And then sliding underneath in itself presents it with some more problems, because now your character might be playing a sliding animation, but it doesn't actually mean that the collider is doing anything to support that slide. So if that's one thing that you need to implement, or if it's one thing that you have in your character that's unique to your character controller, then that is worth spending a little bit more time getting the collider to shrink down when it slides underneath things, just to make sure that the sliding mechanic actually works properly. Okay, so that's a silly example of the type of mechanics, but maybe um, when I was demoing my little white box world, I had enemies running around, and I have slopes and angles and things for the character to jump off, because jumping is a mechanic, and so is falling, and falling a certain distance. So those are all things that I actually needed in my scene to test it. So think about the type of mechanics or elements that you can add just to test things. Even like in this case, there's some just physical boxes and things that this character can run into to make sure that the mass of the character is appropriate. The force that I have assigned to the rigid body as it moves is strong enough to, traverse certain angles, or bump certain objects of a certain mass out of the way. So those are all things that I can then test and explore with, making sure that my character controller is actually doing what it's supposed to do. The same thing goes for, I think I'm gonna run out of examples soon, but while I'm thinking about them, with a nav mesh agent controller, for instance, you want to set up certain obstacles to make sure that the controller actually moves around those obstacles, or up and down those obstacles, instead of just through them. Obviously then the nav mesh isn't very successful. So your final hand in is only at the end of week 8, and that's your complete character playground demo build. This is sort of a loose term for it. I think the official one was called, let me just check. It's just called demo build. Okay, so I've sort of added the character playground element just so that you can sort of keep in mind what I'm looking for. It's not just a white box world that's entirely flat and keeps your character from falling off the edge. It's actually putting things into the scene that complements your particular character controller. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Here's an extract from a book by Scott Rogers called Level Up. It's one of your prescribed books. It's in the library as well if you do ever get there and want to hold a physical book in your hand. I know it's probably been such a long time for you guys since you last held a physical book in your hand, but if you do want to have that experience, maybe over a long weekend, go to the library, hold a book. In that book, besides the fact that there's also a recipe for I think there's a recipe for disaster. There's a recipe for chili or something like that. It's a very awkward book. Making a chili. All right, so there's a chili recipe towards the end of it. It's very sort of informally put together. So there's lots of pictures and things in between, and it's really nicely written. It's like this dude, and he looks like he has fun. So it's worthwhile checking it out, and that's also why it's a prescribed book. It talks about really sort of valuable things that we cover throughout the course of like several of the game design years. This 3 C's is really a big deal, and it's sort of what we've been working on mainly is camera and control. Not so much about the character, but the 3 C's is apparently like the main or the most common make or break components of your game. Okay, which is character, the persona of the character, and what you buy into that. The camera, how it functions, and the control scheme, like how you manipulate the character. Okay, so we've been pretty much focusing on the one aspect with a little bit of the other one intertwined. We didn't really focus so much on character, but character I think becomes more of an art aspect, and maybe ties in with the narrative or something like that, but it's not a technical thing. And I don't know if you've noticed by now, but modules are generally more technically orientated, where major is a little bit more sort of aesthetic influences, and a mash of technical and sort of project driven outcomes. Okay, so we try to stick to the technical aspects of building a character controller and everything that entails. Now, what was nice about this book, back to the point, is that towards the end of it, there's a list, sort of a short list, although it is quite long. There's like different types of strategies and different ways of setting up, production stuff, boss fights. There's even like a template for boss fights and figuring that out. No, I don't have the page. There's a boss fight template. With animation lists, movement patterns, and things like that. And that's actually also something that I want to look at today, just sort of movement patterns in general. I went down memory lane looking at all sorts of ancient enemy AI examples, and I'll go through those later on. Okay, so in this book, towards the end of it is an appendix, bonus level 6. He called these appendixes appendices bonus levels, and this one's called mechanics and hazards. And maybe, just maybe, in here there's some, because I thought of going and chatting to you guys about like each one's project, and then looking at what you could and what you couldn't do, and then maybe come up with a list of things that you could potentially add to that. But that just seems like an awful lot of work, and I think you guys are fine to come up with these sort of things by yourself. And if you're not, maybe this is just some sort of inspiration. So like ladders or moving platforms or collapsibles or spinning hazards, rotating platforms, accelerators, like teleports or spring traps or jump pads, whatever you want to call them. So like, yeah, a ton of different mechanics. If you have those in your scene already, or if you have those in your main game, you can just, I suppose you could try and export them as a Unity package. Or what you could do is duplicate the scene in your main game, if you have that, and if anything ties in with it. You're welcome to just strip out some of the functionality. Like I wouldn't, if I'm playing your character controller playground, so to speak, I wouldn't want any quests or any sort of tasks to perform. There shouldn't really be a goal to it, other than trying out the different controls of the character. So you don't have to construct a beginning and an end. You can be nice about it and maybe have the character respawn if it falls off the edge of the map, or maybe have like a exit menu that allows you to quit the app if you want to be cute about it. But it's not essential. I'm literally just trying to find something that I can use as a testing platform to see if all these things are working. And I want to be able to do everything that it can. So again, you're going to need to add a README so that you list all the functionality of the controller, and also just to make sure that I play it and test it properly. Okay, so that's yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a question about that. So if we are doing for our main game, we shouldn't just submit a build of the main game. We should go out and make its own little playground, and we should actively try to avoid adding objectives.
Yeah, okay. So one of the problems with submitting the same thing for two different outcomes is it's the fact that it's exactly the same thing. So I'd rather you take your main build scene, duplicate that, and strip out some of the things that you wouldn't that don't really add to the controller. If you still have I don't know, thinking of your example, if you have harvesting in there, but it needs to have something to harvest in order to perform that action, then by all means keep those things in there. But I don't know, cancel the die state or things like that, or just try and make it different. At least you can't hand in exactly the same thing.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. It has different objectives. The one is meant to be a game and meant to be fun, and the other one's meant to prove that you can create a efficient and effective character controller. So a game with a completely broken character controller could technically still be fun. It could technically still be a game. But not if that was the purpose of the exercise. Okay, go check out Scott Rogers' book Level Up. It's a good read. Lots of gold there. Then okay, so the point with the Animator controller override, or rather I think it's called Animator override controller, which does make sense in itself. I know why they're calling it that, but for me, what you're actually doing is you're using an existing controller and you're simply overriding the animations that are on there. But okay, it has a set of animations incorporated in it. It's not always easy to go and find all those animations and to go and swap them out for other animations, and they might not work quite the same. So there's probably two reasons why you would want to use an Animator override. Okay, the one being multiple player characters that works exactly the same, that you want to then have different animations for. Or the other instance is to have an NPC or maybe one enemy character or enemy logic that you then want to go and replace and use for all your other enemies. I think that's the example that they use in this section on the manual as well. So, like if you had, they said, like a goblin or an ogre or an elf, different enemy types, and you wanted to move differently, even though they're essentially doing the same thing, then you can use this override technique. And I think that actually comes back to my previous point where I went to look at AI behavior and the complexity of AI behavior, and then maybe get back to this. But just so that you know, in short, way to create these little animator controllers is you can go and create them like any other animator controller. It's just an animator override controller. Okay, and it has a little plus sign next to it instead of the animator, so we can go basic loco override. Okay, and then if you add the animator controller that you want to override to that component, it'll list all the animations that it can find inside this animator. Okay, so I'm just going to double check that to make sure that there aren't any. Okay, so the reason why that list is so short is not because of the animator itself, it's actually because of all the missing components in there. Okay, so it doesn't actually pick up any of the missing components, so therefore the only ones that are in there are just the locomotion one. In fact, I can probably trash a whole bunch of things like delete that, and it doesn't even have strafing, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. There was no reason for that really to be in a subcomponent. Also, something that you guys may have or may not have learned by now is that you can copy and paste from pretty much any one animator controller to the next, as long as they're in the same Unity. So it really does help having a bunch of resources or animator controllers or things that you've done in the past to work from. It's like a library of interaction that you can delve into. So it's worth keeping these. Okay, so we've got forward movement as a tree. I don't think we're using any of these things really, so that also doesn't really matter. Okay, so what it's doing is, or that component that I made, the override component, is looking at all the animations in this animator and giving you an opportunity to just go and override those clips right there and then. So that's not particularly complicated. Obviously you want them to sort of match what that was, and it's helpful that those states or clips are all named properly so that you can you know what they are and you can go and swap them out. The only difference then in terms of implementation is taking that basic loco controller override or override controller and applying that as the source within the animator. Okay, so the override is referencing the original and the animator on the character is using the override. Now remember, you can also swap out animations or animator controllers at runtime. So it just occurred to me that you could technically have an animator override controller for an injured player. You could have all his animations swapped out with injured versions of the same thing, and then as soon as he becomes injured, you could swap that instead of building an entire different switch and blend tree and everything for your injured components. Okay, so that's one or another application for it. I am, however, going to swap it back. Don't think we need to fuss too much with that, and I don't know if anyone's really going to use that. But let's have a quick discussion about enemies, right? Who likes them, huh? Right? Okay, so enemy behavior. Now, this isn't particularly academic. It is sort of just an idea and sort of a start of a discussion. Is like, what do enemies normally do in games, right? So they normally chase you or they patrol. They shoot at you when they see you, and they don't if they don't see you, or maybe they're shooting the whole time. Um, and I just sort of started looking at very classic versions of enemy behavior. So I came across the um, it's a document called the Pac-Man dossier, and it's actually an article written by Gamasutra, or one of the writers at Gamasutra, and he basically just went and analyzed the entire Pac-Man for all the mechanics and all the specific sort of behavioral traits, when, what happens, and how and why, including even sort of like analyzing the hardware that they had to work on at that stage. So it's quite a comprehensive document. But what was interesting about it is that when he started talking about um, enemy behavior, it becomes like it's frighteningly simple, but at the same time, it's really and perhaps it also ties in with that other discussion that we or video that we watched about emerging behavior, where you give it very few parameters, but then they sort of seem like they behave intuitively or in a clever way, or have some sort of intelligence based on just fulfilling these parameters. Um, so there are different states. So there's the chase state, the scatter, and the frightened state. Um, then there's, depending on the level, how fast they move or how often it repeats. Um, there's comparison charts. Shows how they corner, which is interesting as well. Like there's a lot of like really subtle things that happen in Pac-Man that are like that go by unnoticed if you don't spend the time to actually dig in and figure out what's going on there. So even though those enemies basically feel like they sort of roam around aimlessly, they have a percentage chance of actually turning in your direction and moving towards you, and that chance, the element of chance, increases based on the level of the game that you're in, and the decision making just gets better and everything sort of improves. But it's all like once you've set up those like parameters of either chasing or scattering or being frightened, um, all you need to do is just bump the values and just say like, well, at this level it's going to start doing this, and that should be easy enough to do as well in even a very simple setup. So if you have a patrolling character, which is fairly easy to do, you can either have it move towards a point using navmesh or just transform or whatever you use depending on the type of character it is, and then you could just, if that's a lerp or if that's a speed variable, you could just bump the speed with every increasing moment in time even. So if the game's run for a considerable amount of time, then those enemies are going to be going much faster than they used to in the beginning. That seems to be very common traits of an enemy, is to speed up with difficulty, maybe increase in hit points with difficulty, maybe cause more damage. The extent of their intelligence is limited. Like we don't want to go and create an entire neural network for an enemy. Um, end up creating some sort of an apocalyptic event. You just want something that presents you with a fair amount of challenge. Okay, so also think of enemies or AI or things that you could add and parameters that you could tweak. And it doesn't necessarily even need to be an enemy. Like if you have a moving platform, you could simply, based on the amount of time that the game's been running, increase the speed of that moving platform. And already it'll become more difficult the longer you wait and the longer you play and the more familiar you become with the game. All right, so it's actually very simple to sort of add these sort of parameters. What did I think in another scene, I simply had a character patrol from left to right. I've actually removed all the shooting and everything from that. I'll put it back and then show you guys just quickly next week once I've got my entire playground sort of finished up to the point where I can't afford to spend any more time on it. Which is probably what's going to happen with yours as well. Choose simple mechanics that you can add that adds a little bit of fun. But again, if it becomes too difficult to figure it out, if you're using a navmesh agent, for example, and now suddenly you want a jump pad or something in the scene, then that could present you with like an enormous amount of work. use things that make it simple enough for you to execute within a small amount of time, and that adds, sort of value for time. Okay. Okay, that's controller overrides. Normally, then, I've actually found that using character animators, like for that you would use for your player character, work fairly well for enemies as well. And you could almost just go and swap out the control scripts. So the only difference being that the one reads input and the other one reads um, sort of events. Like it's either triggered or it collided with the enemy, and now an event sets off something, and then it needs to move, or it needs to change direction, or it needs to set its location to where the character is. Those sort of things. But I think one thing that probably bugs me the most in games with very simple enemies is that sort of relentless chasing that you find in some enemy AI. So please just put something in so that the character that you can lose the character or something of the sorts. They shouldn't be able to just chase you across the world indefinitely. Okay, so whatever you add, make it reasonable. And yeah, and if it's too difficult, I guess I would play the demo several times before giving up. But yeah, try and try and keep it within reason. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to show you, and perhaps there's some way of combining these. I haven't quite figured out. I'm not an avid user of these tools, the overrides and things, and ragdolls. I haven't really had the need to use them all that much, and they're somewhat temperamental, to be honest. But okay, so if you want to set up a ragdoll is also a component that you add, similar to like an object to your game, really. So if you go to your game objects, 3D objects, you'll find ragdoll under the list. Okay, but it comes with sort of a disclaimer, because you can't add a ragdoll to an object that doesn't have a rig. Okay, so I mean I could try and do that. Game object. I don't know what it will say. It will probably just say no. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't actually pick up that it doesn't have bones. So it will still try, but it won't. As you can see, there's not much you can do if you don't have a rig. It's also asking for the character to be in a T stance. I suppose it's useful because what this is, in fact, is not really the ragdoll itself. This is simply a wizard that's running to create the ragdoll for you. Okay, so what you would need to do is, if I go and put it on another object that actually has, I'm going to just run that again. I've pre-populated that list and then executed the wizard, and now I deleted it. Okay, so let me just grab that character again. Okay. Okay, so the ragdoll wants you to, or wizard wants you to pick the different bones from your character and populate this list. So I'm just going to go and sort of do that quite loosely. It mentions left hips and left and right hips, and I think what it's actually trying to say is thigh. Or maybe it just picks or it refers to the root, perhaps. But okay, be that as it may. So we've got left thigh, left leg, and left foot. Okay, and then the same for the right. So we have right thigh, right leg, right knee, and right foot. And then we have left arm. Sorry, that is actually under spine. It's only arm left arm and elbow. So I don't use the shoulders, I just use the arms. So that's left arm, and then left forearm where the elbow is supposed to be, and then the same for the right and the right forearm, and the middle spine, which is I suppose just the spine, and then the head bone, which is over there. Total mass of this character, I don't actually know what mass units are for in Unity. I've never used any sort of physical reference for it, but I tend to make my characters of a mass of like 10-ish, close to 10, because yeah, sometimes I want it to affect objects around it, smaller objects, and those are normally less than 10, and anything bigger than a human, like a car, I would make 20 or something like that, so that they would affect the character, and probably go and tweak it if I can see that the physics is off, but I don't actually use real physics. What on earth are you complaining about? Okay, I said spine there, spine. Okay, so I'll use the root as the spine, as the pelvis. Okay. I think it's facing the right direction, so I don't have a problem with flipping it forward or anything like that. And then once you've created it, or once you're done, you can hit create, and then what it essentially does is it just creates colliders with rigid bodies on each and every bone. Okay, so by default, I think you should be able to just, once the wizard has done his magic, you should just be able to play, and then and then it ragdolls. Okay, you can set up various parameters for the ragdoll to adhere to. Let me just see if I can drop this ragdoll on top of a cube or something. Bah, doesn't want to go into the cube, but it is quite fun slamming it against it. All right, come here. Okay, so it's a fairly reluctant thing to work with in the first place. Okay, it doesn't. It's just a bunch of colliders with rigid body with character constraints on them. Okay, that's all it is. So there's no component. It adds an animator component, and I'll tell you just now, or I'll show you why this is important. If there's no there's an animator on this, but if there's no actual controller, then the rigid body physics will take over. So if I now go back to the controllers and add the basic locomotion controller and press play, it still has all the rigid body components on it, but it's not going to perform the ragdoll effect while the animator is active. So basically one way of animating this, or activating it rather, is an enemy AI would probably have an animator that makes it move around, and the moment that you shoot it, or the moment that you trigger a sort of an injury or a death event, then you could toggle and switch off the animator, which means then the ragdoll takes over. Okay, and it is kind of cool because it's, it's unique death animations basically, but it comes with some glitches. Okay. One thing that you need to do is check that the colliders don't intersect like severely, and also one thing that would probably also become a problem later on is your character will most likely also have a collider and a rigid body, right? Because why wouldn't it? Yeah, I'll probably not do that in play mode. I'm going to add just a standard capsule collider, sort of place it in the middle, and then just see what havoc emerges from this. Okay, so let's say that's that, and yes, a rigid body. If we were doing character related stuff, we may just want to freeze those rotations quickly, but now already, okay, who can tell me what happens when you intersect two colliders? Ah, and there he goes. I'm not doing anything. He doesn't even have any controls. He's not supposed to be moving at all. Yet, he's even jumping a little bit. That's great, guys. Just make your enemies do that. Okay. Um, so obviously the two colliders, even though yeah, and eventually falls off. Like, okay, I suppose you could make this a trigger, but you like this is what you've set up so that your character doesn't fall through the ground or can jump off things and whatnot. So it's essential to have this, and it's not currently essential to have all of these other colliders. Okay. Now, the trick though, or the workaround would be to um, basically toggle the colliders on all these elements. So you need to create a sort of a list, or you need to drag in all these colliders and then switch them off and back on when you need them. Okay, so there's no, even though, like, I think it would be fun for those of you that, you know, didn't use rigid bodies or physical colliders for your characters, to just have a rigid body, I mean a ragdoll in there and activate it or deactivate your animator and just watch it squirm. But for most people, you're going to have to go through the painstaking process of finding all the colliders, deactivating them, and then activating the right ones and swapping them out as, you know, the event occurs, as you want them to become rigid bodies. And I mean, there's not that many of them, and they're all there in the root. Otherwise, what you could also do, potentially, which I haven't done, but I know you can do it, you can create a collider mask. Okay, yeah, that's in physics. Okay, so player and player shouldn't collide with each other. Maybe that should fix it out. If that was tagged as player, sorry, I don't think I did. So we're probably going to see the same thing again. Okay, and then Humanoid Pro, that's just the name of the guy. Player, yes, change children. And then Project Physics, Player Collider Matrix. Player and player aren't supposed to collide with each other. So let's see if that works. All right. So that is actually working. Okay. Now, in some instances, you are going to have to switch on all those colliders and switch them all off again. In this case, this seems to work for now. I suspect some other things might come into play. Obviously, those two things can't intersect. And this guy would fall out of the air. So I'm going to give him something to... I can't move that because it's static. I'm going to give him something to fall off of. Tricky. Fine. And no animator. Ah, ugh. Okay. It does seem... okay, yeah. The first time it wasn't... The first time it was quite severe. Like, it sort of jumped. And I'm not sure... And there it goes again. It's like... The results are quite varied. It's a lot of fun seeing the little guy squirm though. Okay. I think the only other thing left in here is the actual components that we need to just have a look at in case we need to change those. Okay, so like I said, each bone is then just fitted with a box collider and a character joint. a rigid body, a box collider, and a character joint. Now, on the character joint itself, you can go set certain, like if you find that the twisting and things are happening too often, or there's some intersection happening or something like that, then you can go and tweak the angle limits of each bone. So if you look at the angle limits of that one, I think let's do a forearm or something like that. It looks very similar to the type of controls that you'd get when you set up your muscle system for your character. Okay, so there it basically says or shows in which directions, how far it can rotate in which directions. And I think if you've got it works similar to the edit the collider element there. You can then go and tweak those manually by simply dragging the components and then making sure that rotation only happens to that extent. Again, if it's a fatter character, then maybe you want to set that up this way. Otherwise, the collider should for most part keep his body parts untangled. But yeah, that's pretty much as much fun as you can have with a rigid body. Just controlling the animator to toggle or trigger the rigid, the ragdoll. Bleh. Bleh. All right, cool.